The blood on Rebecca Owens's dress had finally dried to a rust-brown stain by the time she reached the rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, though the tears streaming down her face were still fresh and hot. It was August of 1876, in the Dakota Territory, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the endless expanse of prairie grass and jagged rock formations that surrounded the small settlement of Sioux Falls. She had walked for miles from the town, her boots rubbing blisters on her heels, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollowness in her chest where her mother's locket had rested just hours before. Rebecca sank down onto a sun-warmed boulder and let the sobs come freely now that there was no one around to hear her grief. The locket had been the only thing she had left of her mother, who had died giving birth to Rebecca's younger brother 5 years ago. Inside the delicate gold oval were 2 tiny portraits painted on ivory, one of her mother as a young woman, the other of her father before consumption had taken him last winter. Now both her parents were gone, and she had lost the one precious keepsake that connected her to them. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to stem the flow of tears, but it was useless. The morning had started so hopefully, too. She had been traveling west with a wagon train, hoping to reach her aunt in California, when the train had been attacked by outlaws just outside of Sioux Falls. The bandits had shot the wagon master and 2 other men before making off with most of the supplies and money. In the chaos, Rebecca had helped tend to the wounded, getting blood on her dress and hands as she tried to stop the bleeding of a young father who had taken a bullet to the shoulder. It was only after the bandits had fled and the survivors had limped into Sioux Falls that Rebecca realized the locket was gone. She had torn through her belongings 3 times, searched every inch of the wagon she had been traveling in, and retraced her steps through the town until her feet ached. Nothing. The chain must have broken during the attack or perhaps when she was tending to the wounded. She had no way of knowing where it had fallen, and the thought of it lying in the dirt somewhere, trampled or lost forever, made her want to scream. The sound of footsteps on gravel made her look up sharply, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she kept in her boot. But the man approaching was not moving with the furtiveness of someone with ill intent. He was simply walking toward her with long, purposeful strides, his massive frame silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky. Samuel Turner had lived in these hills for the better part of 3 years, and he knew every rock, every stream, every animal track in the territory. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they strained against the buckskin shirt he wore. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders, though he usually kept it tied back with a leather cord. His face was weathered from years of living outdoors, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble, and his eyes were a striking pale blue that seemed almost startling against his sun-darkened skin. His arms were thick with muscle from chopping wood, hauling water, and wrestling with the harsh land that was now his home. He had been hunting when he heard the gunshots that morning, and by the time he reached the wagon train, the outlaws were gone and townspeople from Sioux Falls were already helping the survivors. Samuel preferred to keep to himself, but something about the young woman with blood on her dress and determination in her eyes had caught his attention. He had watched from a distance as she tirelessly helped the wounded, her hands steady even as others panicked. And then, hours later, he had seen her walking out of town alone, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Samuel did not make a habit of involving himself in other people's troubles. He had come to the Dakota Territory to escape his own painful past, and solitude had served him well. But there was something about seeing this woman in such obvious distress that he could not ignore. Perhaps it was the way she had helped others even in the midst of danger, Or perhaps it was simply that he recognized the kind of grief that could not be shared with strangers in a town. "You ought not to be out here alone," he said when he was close enough to speak without shouting. His voice was deep and rough from disuse, like gravel rolling in a stream. "There are still outlaws in these parts, and wild animals too." Rebecca started at the sound of his voice and quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, though it was obvious she had been crying. "I needed to be away from people," she said, her voice hoarse. "I mean no offense, sir, but I would prefer to be alone." Samuel stopped about 10 feet away, giving her space. Up close, he could see that she was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and tumbled around her shoulders in waves. Her dress was a simple calico print, now stained with blood and dust, and her face was pale beneath a dusting of freckles. But it was her eyes that struck him most, large and brown and filled with a sadness that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "I saw you this morning," he said. "You helped those people. That took courage, courage," she repeated bitterly. "I do not feel very courageous. I feel like the greatest fool who ever lived." Samuel tilted his head slightly. "Why is that?" Rebecca hesitated. She did not know this man, and her aunt had always warned her about speaking to strange men, especially out in the wilderness. But there was something in his steady gaze and calm demeanor that made her feel he was not a threat. Perhaps it was simply that she was so tired of holding everything inside. "I lost something," she said finally. "Something very precious to me. It was a locket that belonged to my mother. It held portraits of both my parents, and now they are both gone, and the locket is gone too, and I have nothing left of them." Her voice broke on the last words, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She turned away, embarrassed by her display of emotion in front of a stranger. Samuel felt something tighten in his chest. He understood loss, perhaps better than most. He had lost his own family years ago, and the pain of it had driven him into these mountains where he could be alone with his grief. "Where did you last see it?" he asked. Rebecca shook her head. "I do not know. The chain must have broken during the attack this morning, or maybe when I was helping the wounded. I have looked everywhere in town, but it could be anywhere along the trail or trampled in the dirt, or someone could have already taken it." "The attack happened about 5 miles east of here," Samuel said thoughtfully. "And you came into town from there, then searched the town itself." "Yes," Rebecca said, turning back to look at him with red-rimmed eyes. "But it is hopeless. You know how much ground that covers. It could be anywhere." Samuel was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes distant as he thought. Then he said, "I can track a deer through these hills by nothing more than a broken twig or a bent blade of grass. I reckon I can find a locket." Rebecca stared at him. "What?" "I said I will find it for you," Samuel repeated. "I know this land better than anyone. If your locket is out there, I will bring it back." "But why?" Rebecca asked, confusion and hope warring in her expression. "You do not even know me. Why would you do this?" Samuel met her eyes, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The truth was, he was not entirely sure why himself. Maybe it was because he recognized the kind of grief that could not be soothed by words alone. Maybe it was because he had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to help someone. Or maybe it was simply because, when he looked at this young woman with tears on her cheeks and determination in her eyes despite her sorrow, he felt something stir in his chest that he had thought long dead. "Because you should not have to carry that loss," he said finally. "You have already carried enough." Rebecca felt her breath catch in her throat. No one had said anything like that to her in a very long time. Since her parents died, she had been expected to be strong, to keep going, to take care of her younger brother until he had been sent to live with relatives back east. No one had acknowledged that she was tired, that she was grieving, that she needed someone to help her for once. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "You do not need to say anything," Samuel said. "Where are you staying in town?" "At the boarding house on Main Street," Rebecca said, "but I have very little money left. I was supposed to continue west with the wagon train, but after today, I do not know if they will keep going, and I cannot afford passage on another." "Do not worry about that now," Samuel said. "You go back to the boarding house and rest. I will start searching at first light tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Rebecca asked. "But it is still afternoon. You could start now." Samuel shook his head. "Tracking takes time and patience. I need good light, and I need to start from the beginning where the attack happened. That means starting fresh in the morning." He paused, then added, "Besides, you look like you could use some rest yourself." Rebecca wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She was exhausted, emotionally and physically. The thought of walking all the way back to town seemed almost impossible, but she forced herself to stand on shaky legs. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I am Rebecca Owens, by the way." "Samuel Turner," he replied with a small nod. "Most folks around here call me Sam when they call me anything at all." "You live out here alone?" Rebecca asked as they began walking back toward town together. Samuel adjusted his pace to match hers, which was considerably slower than his usual ground-eating stride. "I do," he confirmed. "Got a cabin about 3 miles north of here, up in the hills. It suits me." "That sounds lonely," Rebecca said before she could stop herself. Then she flushed. "I apologize, that was rude of me." "It is lonely," Samuel admitted, "but sometimes lonely is better than the alternative." Rebecca glanced at him curiously, but something in his expression told her not to press the subject. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on the rocky ground and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "How long have you been traveling?" Samuel asked eventually, more to break the silence than anything else. 3 months, Rebecca said. "I left Missouri in May. My aunt lives in Sacramento, and she said I could come stay with her after my father died. I sold our house to pay for my brother's care back east and my passage west, but there was not much left after that." "That is a long journey for a woman alone," Samuel observed. "I was not alone at first," Rebecca said. "I was traveling with the wagon train, and there were families, other single women. It felt safe enough. Until this morning." She shuddered at the memory of the gunshots, the screams, the blood. "The outlaws who attacked you are part of a gang that has been terrorizing the territory for months," Samuel said grimly. "The law has been trying to track them down, but they move fast and know the land well. They likely headed north after the attack, but they will be back eventually." "They always come back." "That is a frightening thought," Rebecca said quietly. "It is the reality of living out here," Samuel said. "The Dakota Territory is still wild country. There is law in the towns, but outside of them, it is every man for himself. That is why you should not have been out walking alone." "I know," Rebecca said, "but I was not thinking clearly. I just needed to get away." They reached the outskirts of Sioux Falls as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a church, and the boarding house where Rebecca was staying. There were perhaps 200 people living in the town itself, with more scattered throughout the surrounding area on homesteads and ranches. Samuel walked Rebecca all the way to the boarding house, ignoring the curious stares of the townspeople they passed. Most folks in Sioux Falls knew of Samuel Turner, the mountain man who lived alone in the hills and only came into town a few times a year for supplies. He had a reputation as someone to be left alone, and people generally obliged. "Thank you for walking with me," Rebecca said when they reached the front steps of the boarding house. "And thank you for offering to search for the locket. It means more to me than you could possibly know." "I will find it," Samuel said with quiet confidence. "Be ready to show me exactly where you were during the attack and after. Any detail you can remember might help." Rebecca nodded. "I will. Should I meet you somewhere in the morning?" "I will come here at dawn," Samuel said. "We will start from there." He tipped his head to her in a gesture that was almost courtly, then turned and walked away, his long legs carrying him quickly down the dusty street. Rebecca watched him go, this strange mountain man who had appeared out of nowhere and offered to help her without asking for anything in return. She did not know what to make of him, but for the first time since losing the locket, she felt a small flicker of hope. Inside the boarding house, Rebecca washed the blood and dirt from her hands and face and tried to clean her dress as best she could. The other residents, mostly women traveling west and a few miners passing through, gathered in the common room for supper, but Rebecca had no appetite. She sat by the window in her small room and watched the sun set over the valley, thinking about her parents and the locket and the mysterious man who had promised to find it. Samuel, meanwhile, made his way back to his cabin as twilight descended over the hills. The cabin was small but well built, with a stone fireplace, a bed frame he had constructed himself, and a few pieces of simple furniture. It was not much, but it was his, and after years of fighting in the war and then drifting from place to place trying to outrun his memories, having a place to call his own meant something. He lit a fire and prepared a simple meal of dried venison and beans, his mind already working through the logistics of the search ahead. 5 miles of trail, plus the area around where the attack had occurred, plus the route into town. It would take days to search thoroughly, maybe longer. But he had made a promise, and Samuel Turner was a man who kept his word. As he lay in his bed that night, listening to the wind whisper through the pine trees outside, Samuel found himself thinking about Rebecca Owens. There had been something about her that had struck him deeply, something beyond her obvious distress over the lost locket. She had a quality he could not quite name, a combination of vulnerability and strength that reminded him of why he had once believed in goodness in the world, before the war had shown him otherwise. He had not felt drawn to another person in years, not since he had lost his wife and infant daughter to cholera back in Kansas. That loss had nearly destroyed him, and he had vowed never to open himself up to that kind of pain again. But something about Rebecca had slipped past his defenses without him even realizing it. And now he found himself wanting not just to find her locket, but to see her smile, to take away the sadness in her eyes. Samuel shook his head at his own foolishness. He barely knew the woman, and she would be moving on to California as soon as the wagon train left or she found another way west. There was no point in letting himself feel anything. He would find the locket, return it to her, and go back to his solitary life in the mountains. That was the sensible thing to do. But as he drifted off to sleep, his last thoughts were of brown eyes filled with tears and auburn hair catching the light of the setting sun. Dawn came cold and clear, with a mist rising from the ground that would burn off within an hour of sunrise. Samuel was up before first light, as was his habit, and he made his way into town just as the sun crested the eastern horizon. He found Rebecca already waiting on the front steps of the boarding house, dressed in a clean brown dress with her hair neatly pinned. She looked like she had not slept much, but her eyes were clear and determined. "Good morning," she said as he approached. "I have been thinking about yesterday, trying to remember every detail of where I went." "Good," Samuel said. "Let us start with the attack. Can you ride?" "Yes," Rebecca said, "but I do not have a horse. "You can ride with me," Samuel said, gesturing to the large bay horse tied nearby. "It will be faster than walking." Rebecca hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. It was not entirely proper for a woman to ride with a man she barely knew, but propriety seemed less important than finding her mother's locket. Samuel mounted first, then reached down and pulled her up behind him with easy strength. Rebecca had to put her arms around his waist to keep her balance, and she was suddenly very aware of the solid wall of muscle that made up his back and shoulders. They rode out of town at a steady pace, Samuel guiding the horse with practiced ease. Rebecca described the attack as they went, pointing out landmarks she remembered. The wagon train had been moving along the main trail when the outlaws had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, firing shots into the air, and then at the wagons themselves when people tried to resist. "I was in the third wagon," Rebecca said. "When the shooting started, I dropped down between the crates for cover. Then I heard someone screaming that Mr. Patterson had been shot. That is the man I helped, the one with the shoulder wound. I climbed out of the wagon and ran to him. There were 2 other men hurt as well, and I tried to help them all." They reached the site of the attack, which was still marked by the deep ruts of wagon wheels and scattered debris. Samuel dismounted and helped Rebecca down, then began to examine the ground with intense focus. He walked slowly back and forth, his eyes scanning every inch of dirt, every rock, every tuft of grass. "Show me exactly where you were," he said. Rebecca walked to a spot near where the third wagon would have been. "I was about here when I first dropped down. Then I moved over there, where Mr. Patterson was lying." She pointed to a spot about 20 feet away. Samuel moved to where she indicated and knelt down, running his fingers over the ground. The earth here was darker, stained with blood that had soaked into the dry soil. He could see the impressions of boots, several different sets, and the marks where someone had knelt. "You were here for how long?" he asked. "Maybe 10 minutes, Rebecca said. "I was trying to stop the bleeding. Then some other people came to help, and we carried him into one of the wagons to bring him into town." Samuel nodded and continued his careful examination. He moved in a widening circle around the spot where Rebecca had been, his eyes missing nothing. A broken button, a spent shell casing, scraps of cloth torn in the chaos, but no locket. "Let us check the route into town," he said after nearly an hour of searching. They mounted again and followed the trail slowly, with Samuel stopping frequently to examine the ground. Rebecca watched him work, fascinated by his patience and attention to detail. She had never seen anyone move with such purpose, as if every action was deliberate and meaningful. The sun climbed higher, and the day grew hot. Samuel never seemed to notice the heat, his focus entirely on the search. They reached the edge of town by midday, and Samuel began searching the streets where Rebecca had walked after arriving. She showed him every place she had been, every spot she had stopped or knelt to check her belongings. "You said you helped carry Mr. Patterson into town," Samuel said. "Was he in a wagon or were you on foot?" "We put him in a wagon," Rebecca said. "I rode in the back with him to keep pressure on the wound." "Which wagon?" Samuel asked. Rebecca pointed to a wagon that was now parked outside the general store. "That one, I think. It belonged to a family named Miller." Samuel approached the wagon and began examining it thoroughly, checking between the boards, under the seat, in every crevice and corner. Rebecca held her breath, hoping against hope that the locket might have fallen into some hidden spot and been overlooked. But after a thorough search, Samuel straightened up and shook his head. "Not here," he said. Rebecca's shoulders sagged. "Maybe it is truly lost then. Maybe someone found it and kept it, or it fell somewhere that we will never be able to search." "I am not giving up yet," Samuel said firmly. "There is still a lot of ground we have not covered. The area around where you first knelt to help Mr. Patterson, that is where I think it most likely came off. The chain could have caught on something during the struggle and snapped. I want to go back there and search more carefully." "It is already afternoon," Rebecca said. "You have been searching all day. You must be tired and hungry." "I am fine," Samuel said. But even as he spoke, his stomach betrayed him with a low rumble. Rebecca could not help but smile a little. "You need to eat," she said. "And so do I, if I am being honest. Let us get some food and then we can continue searching." Samuel wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. A man could not track effectively if he was weak from hunger. "All right," he agreed reluctantly. "There is a place that serves decent food near the edge of town." They walked together to a small restaurant that was little more than a converted house, where a woman named Mrs. Henley served meals to travelers and townsfolk. She gave them a curious look when they entered together, but said nothing as she served them plates of fried chicken, potatoes, and biscuits. Rebecca ate ravenously, realizing she had not had a proper meal since the day before. Samuel ate more slowly, his mind still clearly on the search. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Rebecca spoke. "Why do you live alone out there?" she asked quietly, "if you do not mind my asking." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Rebecca thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "I lost my family some years back. My wife and daughter. After that, I did not much see the point in being around people. The mountains are peaceful, they do not judge and they do not die on you." Rebecca felt her heart clench with sympathy. "I am so sorry," she said softly. "I cannot imagine how painful that must have been." "It was a long time ago," Samuel said, though the tightness in his voice suggested the pain was still fresh even after all these years. "What about you? No husband or sweetheart waiting for you in California?" "No," Rebecca said. "There was a young man back in Missouri who wanted to court me, but after my parents died, I just could not think about such things. My brother needed me, and then when he was sent to live with our uncle, all I wanted was to get to California and start over. I wanted to be somewhere that did not remind me of everything I had lost." "I understand that," Samuel said, meeting her eyes. "Sometimes a new place is the only way to begin healing." They finished their meal and returned to the site of the attack, this time with Samuel focusing intensely on the specific area where Rebecca had knelt to help the wounded man. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant westward, creating long shadows across the ground. Samuel got down on his hands and knees, examining every inch of earth with painstaking care. Rebecca watched him, feeling both hopeful and hopeless at the same time. The locket was so small, and the area was so vast. What were the chances of finding one tiny piece of gold in all this wilderness? But Samuel did not seem discouraged. He moved methodically, section by section, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he sifted through dirt and pebbles. An hour passed, then two. The sun continued its descent, and Rebecca was about to suggest they call it a day when Samuel suddenly froze. "Come here," he said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. Rebecca hurried over to where he was kneeling. "Did you find it?" "No," Samuel said, "but I found this." He held up a broken gold chain, delicate and fine. "This is yours." Rebecca took the chain with shaking hands. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, this is it. This is the chain from the locket." "Then the locket must be nearby," Samuel said, renewed energy in his voice. "The chain broke here, which means the locket fell somewhere in this area. Help me search." They both got down on their hands and knees, carefully examining the ground. The sun was getting lower, and Rebecca knew they were running out of light. Her hands were scraped and dirty, her knees aching, but she did not care. The locket was here somewhere, she could feel it. "Rebecca," Samuel said quietly. "Look." She looked up and saw him holding something small and golden in his large palm. Even covered in dirt, she recognized it immediately. Her mother's locket, the precious keepsake she thought was lost forever. "Oh," Rebecca gasped, tears springing to her eyes as she reached for it. "Oh, you found it. You actually found it." Samuel carefully placed the locket in her hands, and Rebecca cradled it like it was the most precious thing in the world, which to her it was. She used the edge of her skirt to wipe away the dirt, revealing the delicate engraving on the front, the tiny clasp that still held the portrait safe inside. She opened it with trembling fingers and nearly sobbed with relief when she saw that both miniature paintings were intact, completely undamaged. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Samuel with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you so much. I do not know how to repay you for this." Samuel felt something shift in his chest as he looked at her tear-stained face, now glowing with joy instead of grief. "You do not need to repay me," he said gruffly. "I am just glad we found it." Rebecca did something then that surprised both of them. She threw her arms around Samuel's neck and hugged him tightly, the locket clutched in one hand. For a moment, Samuel froze, unaccustomed to such contact after so many years alone. Then, slowly, his arms came up and wrapped around her, and he found himself holding her close, feeling the warmth of another human being for the first time in longer than he could remember. They stayed like that for several heartbeats, and when Rebecca finally pulled back, she was blushing furiously. "I apologize," she said. "That was forward of me." "It is all right," Samuel said, his own voice rougher than usual. He could still feel the phantom sensation of her in his arms, and part of him wanted to pull her back. The sun was nearly at the horizon now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. Samuel helped Rebecca to her feet, and they walked back to where he had left his horse. Neither of them spoke, but the silence felt different now, charged with something neither was quite ready to name. When they reached his horse, Samuel mounted and then pulled Rebecca up behind him again. The ride back to town felt shorter than the ride out, even though Samuel deliberately kept the pace slow. He was acutely aware of her arms around his waist, the soft pressure of her body against his back. He told himself he was being foolish, that she was just a woman passing through, and he had no business entertaining any thoughts about her. But his heart, long dormant, had other ideas. They reached the boarding house just as the last light was fading from the sky. Samuel helped Rebecca down, his hands lingering on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. "I do not know how I can ever thank you properly," Rebecca said, clutching the locket and broken chain to her chest. "You spent your entire day searching for this." "It was worth it," Samuel said simply, "to see you smile." Rebecca felt her breath catch. There was something in the way he looked at her, something warm and intense that made her pulse quicken. She realized that despite having only known him for a day, she trusted this man more than she had trusted anyone in a long time. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that made her feel safe. "Will I see you again?" she asked before she could stop herself. Samuel hesitated. The sensible thing would be to say no, to wish her well and return to his cabin and his solitary life. But looking at her standing there in the lamplight that spilled from the boarding house windows, her hair slightly mussed and her eyes bright with gratitude and something else he was afraid to name, he found he could not do it. "I will be in town tomorrow," he said. "I need to pick up some supplies at the general store. Perhaps I could see you then." "I would like that," Rebecca said softly. "Very much." Samuel nodded, then turned and mounted his horse before he could say or do something foolish. He rode out of town quickly, his mind churning with conflicting emotions. He had spent 3 years building walls around his heart, convincing himself that solitude was not just preferable but necessary. And now, in the space of a single day, a woman with auburn hair and sad brown eyes had started to crack those walls without even trying. Rebecca watched him ride away, then went inside and up to her small room. She sat on the bed and carefully examined the locket in the light of the oil lamp, making sure once more that everything was intact. The faces of her parents looked back at her from their tiny portraits, and for the first time since losing them, she felt not just grief, but also gratitude. Gratitude that she had these images to remember them by, and gratitude for the mountain man who had cared enough to spend his day helping a stranger. She fell asleep that night with the locket clutched in her hand and dreams of pale blue eyes and strong, gentle hands. The next morning, Rebecca woke early and took extra care with her appearance. She told herself it was simply because she wanted to look presentable after 2 days of searching through dirt, but part of her knew it was because she hoped to see Samuel again. She wore her best dress, a deep green calico that brought out the color of her eyes, and carefully pinned her hair. She had the locket repaired at the jeweler's shop first thing, wincing at the cost, but knowing it was necessary. The jeweler, an elderly man with spectacles, admired the craftsmanship and promised to have it ready by afternoon. Rebecca then spent the morning helping Mrs. Jenkins, who ran the boarding house, with some mending in exchange for a reduced rate on her room. She could not afford to keep staying there much longer, but she also could not leave Sioux Falls just yet. The wagon train she had been traveling with had decided to wait a few days before moving on, giving people time to recover from the attack and decide if they wanted to continue. It was nearly noon when Rebecca saw Samuel through the window, walking down the main street toward the general store. Her heart gave an unexpected leap, and she quickly set down her mending and hurried outside, trying not to look too eager. "Good afternoon," she called out as she approached him. Samuel turned, and his serious expression softened when he saw her. "Afternoon," he replied. "You look well rested." "I slept better than I have in weeks," Rebecca admitted. "Knowing the locket is safe makes all the difference. I had the chain repaired this morning. The jeweler said it will be ready this afternoon." "That is good," Samuel said. They stood there for a moment, neither quite sure what to say next. "Are you getting your supplies?" Rebecca asked, gesturing toward the general store. "I am," Samuel confirmed, "though it should not take long." "I do not need much. May I accompany you?" Rebecca asked, then quickly added, "If you do not mind, of course. I have been cooped up doing mending all morning, and I would appreciate the company." Samuel found himself nodding before he had consciously decided to do so. "I would not mind at all." They walked into the general store together, and Rebecca noticed the surprised looks from the proprietor and the few other customers. Clearly, Samuel was not known for socializing, and his appearance with a woman was noteworthy. Samuel seemed oblivious to the attention, methodically selecting the items he needed: flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition, a few other staples. "You make everything else yourself?" Rebecca asked, watching him work. "Most things," Samuel said. "I hunt for meat, grow some vegetables in the summer." "It is a simple life, but it meets my needs." "It sounds peaceful," Rebecca said wistfully. "After so much traveling and uncertainty, peace sounds wonderful." Samuel glanced at her. "When does your wagon train leave?" "In 3 days," Rebecca said. "If I am going to continue to California, I need to be ready." "If?" Samuel asked, catching the uncertainty in her voice. Rebecca sighed. "The truth is, I am not sure anymore. I thought I wanted to go to California, to be with my aunt and start over. But now I am questioning whether running away is really the answer. Maybe I need to face my grief instead of trying to outrun it." "There is wisdom in that," Samuel said quietly. "Though I am hardly one to give advice on the subject. I came here to run away myself." "But you have found peace, have you not?" Rebecca asked. In your cabin in the mountains, Samuel considered this. I found quiet, he said finally, but I am not sure that is the same as peace. Their eyes met and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. They were both wounded souls, both trying to find their way through grief and loss, both unsure of what came next. Samuel paid for his supplies and they walked outside together. The afternoon sun was warm and the town was bustling with activity. A few children ran past, laughing and chasing each other. A woman hung laundry on a line behind one of the houses, life going on, ordinary and precious. Would you like to take a walk? Samuel asked suddenly. There is a creek not far from here, just outside of town. It is a pleasant spot. I would love that, Rebecca said. They walked together through the town and out along a path that led to a narrow creek lined with cottonwood trees. The sound of running water was soothing, and the shade provided relief from the heat. Samuel set down his supplies and they sat on a fallen log near the water's edge. Tell me about your family, Rebecca said, if it is not too painful to speak of. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Rebecca thought he was not going to answer. Then he began to speak, his voice low and measured. Her name was Sarah, he said. My wife. We met in Kansas just before I went off to fight in the war. We had one perfect month together before I left, and when I came back 2 years later, she was still waiting for me. We had a daughter, Emily. She was born in the winter of '71. The most beautiful baby you ever saw, with her mother's dark eyes and a smile that could light up a room. He paused, his jaw tightening. Cholera came through our town that spring. It took Sarah first, then Emily a week later. I buried them both in the cemetery outside of town, and then I left. I could not stay there, could not bear to walk past our house every day and remember what I had lost. So I drifted for a while, and eventually I ended up here in the Dakota Territory. I built my cabin and told myself I was better off alone. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. I am so sorry, Samuel. That is an unbearable loss. It nearly destroyed me, Samuel admitted. For a long time I did not want to keep living, but I found that I could not give up either, not completely. So I existed day after day in the mountains where no one could ask me how I was or tell me time would heal the pain. And has it? Rebecca asked softly. Healed the pain? No, Samuel said honestly, but it has made it bearable, most days anyway. He turned to look at her. What about you? What happened to your parents? Rebecca told him about her mother's death in childbirth, her father's slow decline from consumption, the responsibility of caring for her young brother while barely more than a child herself. She spoke of the loneliness and fear, the determination to keep going for her brother's sake, and finally the decision to send him east when she could no longer provide for him. I felt like I failed him, she said, her voice breaking. I should have been able to keep us together, but I just did not have the means. And then I sold our house and everything in it, and all I had left was the locket and my passage west. You did not fail him, Samuel said firmly. You did what you had to do to give him a chance at a good life. That is not failure, that is love. Rebecca wiped her eyes. Thank you for saying that. I have felt so guilty. Guilt is a heavy burden to carry, Samuel said. I know that well enough myself. They sat in silence for a while, watching the water flow past and listening to the birds in the trees. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who understand each other's pain without needing to explain it. I have not spoken this much about my family in years, Samuel said eventually. I am not sure why I am telling you all this. Maybe because you need to, Rebecca said gently. Maybe we both need to. We have been carrying these things alone for so long. Samuel looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of someone clinging to life, but real, genuine hope that maybe there was still something good waiting for him in this world. And that terrified him more than any outlaw or wild animal ever could. "I should get back," he said, standing abruptly. "I have left my horse tied up in town too long." Rebecca stood as well, hiding her disappointment. She had thought they were connecting, sharing something real, but perhaps she had misread the situation. "Of course," she said. "Thank you for sharing the creek with me. It is a lovely spot." They walked back to town together, but the easy conversation from before was gone, replaced by an awkward tension. When they reached the boarding house, Samuel nodded to her and turned to go. "Samuel," Rebecca called out. He stopped and looked back. "Would you come for supper tomorrow evening, Mrs. Jenkins allows the boarders to have guests occasionally, and I would like to thank you properly for finding my locket." Samuel knew he should say no. Every instinct told him to put distance between himself and this woman who was making him feel things he had sworn never to feel again. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was, "What time?" 6 o'clock, Rebecca suggested. "I will be here," Samuel said, and then he was gone, riding out of town like he was fleeing something. Rebecca watched him go, confused by his sudden change in demeanor but also hopeful. He had agreed to come for supper, which meant he felt something too, even if he was fighting it. The next day seemed to crawl by. Rebecca helped Mrs. Jenkins with more chores, trying to keep busy and not think about the evening ahead. She borrowed some spices and vegetables from the boarding house kitchen and prepared a simple but hearty stew, along with fresh biscuits and dried apple pie for dessert. It was not fancy, but it was the best she could manage with her limited funds and cooking facilities. Samuel spent the day trying to convince himself not to go. He chopped enough firewood to last through the winter, cleaned and oiled all his guns, and even scrubbed his cabin floor, anything to keep his mind off Rebecca Owens. But as the afternoon wore on, he found himself washing up and changing into his cleanest shirt, running a comb through his long hair and even trimming his beard. He told himself he was just being polite, showing proper respect for a woman who had invited him to supper. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wanted to see her again. He wanted to hear her voice and see her smile. He wanted to be near her, even though it scared him senseless. He arrived at the boarding house exactly at 6, and Mrs. Jenkins showed him to the small dining room where Rebecca had set a table. Rebecca was wearing the same green dress from the day before, and she had her mother's locket around her neck now, gleaming softly in the lamplight. "You came," she said, smiling with obvious relief. "I said I would," Samuel replied. They sat down to eat, and at first the conversation was stilted and awkward. But gradually, as the food and the warm atmosphere worked their magic, they both relaxed. They talked about safer topics this time, reminiscing about growing up in their respective towns, sharing stories from before loss had touched their lives. Rebecca laughed at Samuel's tale of trying to catch a wild turkey as a boy and ending up in a creek instead, and Samuel found himself grinning at her description of the time she accidentally dyed all her father's shirts pink while attempting to do laundry. "You are smiling," Rebecca observed. "I do not think I have seen you truly smile before." Samuel touched his face as if surprised to find it was true. "I suppose I have not had much reason to smile in recent years." "Well, I hope to give you more reasons," Rebecca said, then blushed at how forward that sounded. Samuel reached across the table and took her hand, his large calloused palm engulfing her smaller, softer one. "Rebecca," he said seriously, "I need to be honest with you. I am not sure I know how to do this anymore. Opening up to someone, allowing myself to care. Part of me wants to run back to my cabin and never come down from those mountains again. But another part of me, a part I thought was dead, is telling me that maybe I have been alone long enough." Rebecca turned her hand in his so that their fingers intertwined. "I am scared too," she admitted. "I have spent so long just trying to survive, to get through each day, that I had forgotten what it feels like to actually want something. But I want this, Samuel. I want to know you better. I want to see where this might lead." "Even though you are supposed to leave in 2 days?" Samuel asked. "I have been thinking about that," Rebecca said. "I wrote to my aunt yesterday, explaining that I have decided to stay in Sioux Falls for a while, at least through the winter. I can find work here, save some money, and if I still want to go to California in the spring, I can join another wagon train then." Samuel felt his heart pound harder in his chest. "You are staying, if that is all right with you," Rebecca said, suddenly uncertain. "I do not want you to feel pressured. I have other reasons for staying too. I like Sioux Falls, and after so much travel, I am ready to settle somewhere for a bit." "It is more than all right," Samuel said, squeezing her hand. "It is the best news I have heard in a very long time." They finished supper in much higher spirits, and afterward they walked outside to sit on the front porch of the boarding house. The night was clear and cool, with a brilliant canopy of stars overhead. Samuel pointed out constellations, teaching Rebecca the stories behind them that he had learned from the Lakota people who also called this territory home. "I did not know you were friends with the Lakota," Rebecca said. "Friends might be too strong a word," Samuel said. "But we have an understanding. They know I am no threat to their land or their way of life, and I respect their territory. We trade sometimes, and they have taught me a lot about surviving in these mountains. Good people, though the government does not treat them well." "That seems to be true of most things involving the government and anyone who is different," Rebecca said sadly. "My father used to say that the measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable members." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," Samuel observed. "He was," Rebecca said. "I miss him terribly." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Samuel said, "I should go. It is a long ride back to my cabin." "Must you go tonight?" Rebecca asked. "Mrs. Jenkins has a room available if you would like to stay in town. Or if that is too expensive, I could help pay for it, as a thank you for finding my locket." Samuel smiled. "I appreciate the offer, but I need to check on my cabin and make sure everything is secure. But I will come back soon. Tomorrow, if you would like." "I would like that very much," Rebecca said. Samuel stood and helped her to her feet. They stood facing each other on the porch, and for a moment Samuel thought about kissing her. But it was too soon, too fast, even though every fiber of his being wanted to. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Rebecca," he said softly. "Good night, Samuel," she replied, her voice breathless. He mounted his horse and rode away into the darkness, and Rebecca stood on the porch watching until he disappeared from sight. Then she went inside and lay in her bed, touching the spot on her hand where his lips had been and smiling like a fool. Over the next few weeks, Samuel became a regular fixture in Sioux Falls. He would ride into town most days to see Rebecca, and they would walk together along the creek, or she would pack a lunch and they would ride out to some beautiful spot in the valley where they could talk for hours. Rebecca found work helping at the general store 3 days a week and doing mending and sewing for the other townsfolk, which gave her enough money to pay for her room and board with a little left over. The more time they spent together, the more Samuel felt himself falling for her. It was not like what he had felt for Sarah, which had been the passionate love of youth. This was something deeper, built on shared understanding and mutual respect. Rebecca had seen him at his most vulnerable, heard about his past and his pain, and she had not run. Instead, she had stayed and offered her own vulnerability in return. Rebecca was falling just as hard. Samuel made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since her parents died. His quiet strength and gentle kindness toward her stood in stark contrast to his imposing physical presence. She loved watching him move, the easy way he handled his horse and navigated the rough terrain, the casual display of strength when he lifted something heavy or helped her over a difficult spot on the trail. But more than that, she loved the man beneath the muscle and the weathered exterior. She loved his dry sense of humor, the way he listened intently when she spoke, the rare but beautiful smile that transformed his serious face. One afternoon in early September, Samuel took Rebecca to his cabin for the first time. She had been curious about where he lived, and he had finally felt ready to share that part of his life with her. The cabin was small but sturdy, tucked into a clearing surrounded by pine trees with a view of the valley below. Inside, it was clean and sparse, with handmade furniture and few decorations. But Rebecca could see the care that had gone into building it, the way every log was perfectly fitted, every surface smooth and well-maintained. "It is wonderful," she said honestly. "I can see why you love it here. It is so peaceful." "It has been my sanctuary," Samuel said, "but lately I have found myself feeling lonely here. Before, the solitude was what I wanted. Now it just feels empty." Rebecca turned to face him. They were standing close together in the small space, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "It does not have to be empty," she said quietly. Samuel reached up and cupped her face in his large hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "Rebecca, I need you to understand something. I cannot lose someone again. It nearly killed me the first time. If we do this, if we take this step, I need to know you are serious about staying. I need to know this is not just a temporary thing while you figure out what you really want." "I know what I want," Rebecca said firmly. "I want you, Samuel Turner. I want a life with you, here in the Dakota Territory. I want to wake up next to you every morning and go to sleep in your arms every night. I want to build something real and lasting with you." "Are you sure?" Samuel asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Because once I let myself love you, there will be no going back for me. You will have all of me completely and forever." "I am sure," Rebecca whispered. "I love you, Samuel. I think I have loved you since the moment you promised to find my locket, when you saw me at my lowest and decided to help instead of walking away." Samuel pulled her close and kissed her then, a kiss that held years of loneliness and grief, but also hope and new beginnings. Rebecca melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck as she kissed him back with all the love and passion she had been holding inside. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said. "I did not think I could ever feel this way again, but you have brought me back to life." They spent the rest of the afternoon at the cabin, talking about the future, making plans. Samuel wanted to marry her properly, with a ceremony at the church in Sioux Falls. Rebecca wanted that too, but she also wanted to be practical. "I will need to move out of the boarding house," she said. "I cannot afford to keep paying for a room if I am not working full-time." "Move in here," Samuel said immediately. "With me. We can get married next week and you can live here as my wife." Rebecca bit her lip. "It is fast," she said. "People will talk." "Let them talk," Samuel said. "I have waited 3 years for something to make me feel alive again. I am not waiting any longer than necessary." Rebecca laughed, a joyful sound that made Samuel's heart soar. "All right then," she said. "Let us get married next week, but I want to do it properly with a dress and flowers and everything." "Whatever you want," Samuel promised. "I will give you the best wedding Sioux Falls has ever seen." The next week was a whirlwind of activity. Rebecca found a simple but pretty white dress at the general store, and she and some of the other women in town altered it to fit her perfectly. Samuel cleaned and decorated the cabin, building new furniture and even installing curtains at the windows, something he had never bothered with when he lived alone. He also rode into town and formally asked Mrs. Jenkins for permission to marry Rebecca, which amused Rebecca to no end since she was a grown woman and needed no one's permission. "It is about respect," Samuel had explained. "She has been taking care of you, and I want her to know I will take good care of you too." The wedding took place on a sunny September morning at the small church in Sioux Falls. The entire town turned out for the event, curious about the mysterious mountain man who had finally come down from his isolation for love. Rebecca wore her white dress with her mother's locket around her neck, and Samuel wore his best clothes, his hair neatly tied back and his beard freshly trimmed. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When Samuel slipped a plain gold band onto Rebecca's finger and promised to love and protect her for the rest of his days, there were tears in his eyes. When Rebecca made her own vows, promising to stand by him through whatever trials might come, her voice was steady and strong. They kissed as husband and wife, and the small church erupted in applause and cheers. There was a celebration afterward in the town square, with food and music and dancing. Samuel, who claimed he could not dance, surprised everyone by sweeping Rebecca into his arms and waltzing her around with surprising grace. "You lied," Rebecca accused him, laughing. "You can dance." "Sarah taught me," Samuel admitted. "I had not done it in years, but I wanted to dance with my wife." As the sun set and the celebration wound down, Samuel and Rebecca rode back to their cabin together. Samuel carried her over the threshold, and they spent their wedding night wrapped in each other's arms, finally complete. The first months of their marriage were blissful. Rebecca quickly adapted to life in the mountains, learning to cook over the fireplace, tend the small garden, and manage the household while Samuel hunted and trapped and took care of the heavier work. They fell into an easy rhythm, working together during the day and spending their evenings talking by the fire or sitting on the porch watching the stars. As autumn turned to winter, they prepared for the harsh Dakota cold. Samuel taught Rebecca how to cure meat and preserve vegetables, how to read the weather and predict when a storm was coming. Rebecca made warm quilts and curtains, transforming the rough cabin into a cozy home. In December, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. She told Samuel one evening as they sat by the fire, and he stared at her for a long moment before pulling her into his arms and holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Rebecca asked, suddenly worried. She knew about the daughter he had lost, and she was afraid the pregnancy might bring back painful memories. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Samuel said. "I am terrified and overjoyed and grateful all at once. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for giving me this gift." The pregnancy was not easy. Rebecca suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, and as winter deepened, the isolation of the cabin sometimes felt oppressive. But Samuel was endlessly patient and attentive, caring for her with a tenderness that made her fall in love with him even more. In March, when the snow was still thick on the ground but the days were starting to lengthen, Rebecca went into labor. Samuel rode through the snow to fetch the midwife from town, pushing his horse harder than he should have but too desperate to care. The midwife, an experienced woman named Mrs. Anderson, arrived just in time. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Samuel paced outside the cabin, praying to any god who might listen that Rebecca would be all right. He could not lose another wife, could not bear to go through that pain again. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, he heard the cry of a baby. Mrs. Anderson opened the door and smiled at him. "Come meet your son," she said. Samuel rushed inside and found Rebecca propped up in their bed, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "Samuel," she said weakly, "meet our son." Samuel knelt beside the bed and carefully took the baby, who was so small he seemed almost impossibly fragile. The infant had a shock of dark hair and his eyes were closed, his tiny fists waving in the air. "He is perfect," Samuel breathed. "You are amazing. Thank you, my love." They named him Thomas, after Rebecca's father, and he was the joy of their lives. Samuel, who had been so afraid of loving again only to lose everything, found himself completely devoted to his son. He would spend hours just watching Thomas sleep, marveling at each tiny feature. As Thomas grew, so did their family. 2 years after Thomas, Rebecca gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Emily, honoring both Samuel's lost wife and daughter. This birth was easier than the first, and soon their cabin rang with the sounds of children laughing and playing. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters when food was scarce, summers when the heat was oppressive, and always the challenges of living so far from town. But Samuel and Rebecca faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each passing year. Samuel expanded the cabin, adding more rooms for their growing family. He also became more involved with the community in Sioux Falls, using his knowledge of the land to help guide new settlers and occasionally serving as a tracker when someone got lost in the mountains. Rebecca became known for her kindness and her skill with a needle, making beautiful quilts and clothing that she sometimes sold in town to bring in extra money. But more than that, she was known as the woman who had tamed the wild mountain man, who had brought love and light back into Samuel Turner's life. On their 5th anniversary, Samuel surprised Rebecca by taking her back to the spot where he had found her locket. He had carved a small bench and placed it there, with their initials and the date they met carved into the wood. "I wanted to mark the place where my life began again," he explained. "The day I saw you crying, I had no idea that helping you would save me too, but it did, Rebecca. You saved me." "You saved me too," Rebecca said, tears in her eyes. "I was so lost, and you gave me a home, a family, a reason to keep going." They sat on the bench together, holding hands and watching their children play in the grass nearby. Thomas, now 5, was teaching 3-year-old Sarah how to catch butterflies, and their laughter floated on the warm summer breeze. "You ever regret not going to California?" Samuel asked. "Not for a single moment," Rebecca said honestly. "Everything I could ever want is right here." As the years passed, their family continued to grow. They had 2 more children, another son and another daughter, and their cabin in the mountains became a real home, filled with love and laughter and the everyday chaos of raising a family. Samuel, who had once thought he could never be happy again, found that he woke each morning grateful for another day. He watched his children grow and taught them everything he knew about the land. He held Rebecca in his arms each night and thanked whatever force in the universe had brought her into his life. Rebecca, who had once been alone and grieving, found purpose and joy in her family. She wore her mother's locket every day, and she often told her children stories about their grandparents, keeping their memories alive. But she also created new memories, new traditions, new stories that her own children would someday tell their children. When Thomas was 10 and preparing for his first solo hunting trip with his father, Rebecca watched them from the cabin porch. Samuel was teaching Thomas how to track deer, his large hand gentle on his son's shoulder, and she felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. Mrs. Jenkins from the boarding house, who had become a good friend over the years, stood beside her. "You look happy," the older woman observed. "I am," Rebecca said simply. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "That mountain man of yours certainly changed your life," Mrs. Jenkins said with a smile. "We changed each other's lives," Rebecca corrected. "That is what love does. It transforms both people." Years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. Samuel's hair turned gray at the temples, and Rebecca found herself moving a bit slower, her hands occasionally aching from years of sewing and housework. But they faced aging together, supporting each other through the changes that time brought. Their children grew into fine young adults. Thomas became a skilled hunter and tracker like his father, and eventually settled on a homestead not far from their cabin. Sarah Emily married a good man from town and gave Samuel and Rebecca their first grandchildren. The younger two children were still at home, but they too were growing up fast. On their 20th anniversary, Samuel took Rebecca back to the spot where he had found her locket. The bench he had carved all those years ago was still there, weathered but solid. They sat together in the twilight, hands intertwined, comfortable in the silence that comes from 2 decades of knowing each other completely. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Rebecca asked. "When I asked why you would help me." "I said you should not have to carry that loss," Samuel recalled, "that you had already carried enough. You saw me," Rebecca said softly. "Really saw me when I felt invisible to the world. That was when I started to fall in love with you, even though I did not realize it at the time." Samuel brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, just as he had that first night on the boarding house porch. "I saw you because you saw me too. You looked past the gruff exterior and the walls I had built and saw the man underneath who was still capable of love." They sat until the stars came out, counting their blessings and marveling at how far they had come from that day in August of 1876, when a crying woman and a lonely man's paths had crossed. Neither of them had been looking for love, but they had found it anyway, and it had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Eventually, they made their way back to the cabin where a fire was burning in the hearth, and their youngest children had supper waiting. The cabin was warm and welcoming, filled with the accumulated treasures and memories of 20 years of marriage. Rebecca's locket hung in a place of honor on the mantel, and Samuel's first rifle was mounted above it. Everywhere there were signs of their life together, from the children's drawings to the quilt Rebecca had made from scraps of all their old clothes to the books Samuel had painstakingly learned to read, so he could share stories with his children at bedtime. That night, as they lay in bed together, Rebecca touched the ring on her finger, the simple gold band Samuel had given her on their wedding day. "I love you," she said, as she had said thousands of times over the years. "I love you too," Samuel replied, pulling her close. "Today, tomorrow, and always." Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees and the stars shone bright over the Dakota Territory. Inside the cabin, 2 people who had found each other in their darkest moments slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had built something real and lasting together. The years that followed brought more grandchildren, more changes, and eventually the inevitable sorrows of losing friends and watching their own parents' generation pass away. Samuel's joints ached more in the winter, and Rebecca's eyesight grew dim, making it harder to do the fine needlework she loved. But through it all, they had each other. When Samuel was 65 and Rebecca 63, they celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The celebration took place at their cabin, which had been expanded and improved over the years but still retained its essential character as the home Samuel had built with his own hands. Thomas, now a father and grandfather himself, stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass. who taught me that love is not about grand gestures or perfect moments, but about choosing each other every single day, through the good times and the hard times. You have given all of us a foundation of love and stability that we carry with us into our own families. Thank you for showing us what a real marriage looks like. There were tears and laughter, stories and songs. Rebecca sat in the rocking chair Samuel had made for her 40th birthday, her mother's locket still around her neck, watching her family with profound contentment. Samuel stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, and she reached up to cover it with her own. "We did well," she said softly, so only he could hear. "We did better than well," Samuel replied. "We built a legacy." As the sun set on that warm summer evening, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca thought about the young woman she had been 40 years ago. That woman had been lost and alone, crying over a lost locket in the wilderness. She could never have imagined the life that was waiting for her, the love that would save her, the family she would build. And Samuel, watching his children and grandchildren laugh and play in the home he had built, thought about the broken man he had been. He had been so certain that his life was over, that he had nothing left to give to the world. But then Rebecca had walked into his life, and everything had changed. The locket, that small piece of gold that had brought them together, sat safely in its place of honor on the mantel. It had carried Rebecca's parents' memories, and now it carried the memory of how Samuel and Rebecca had found each other. Someday it would be passed down to their children, along with the story of how a mountain man had searched an entire valley to find it, and in doing so, had found something far more precious: love, family, and a reason to live again. As night fell and the celebration wound down, Samuel and Rebecca walked slowly to the bench he had carved so many years ago. Moving was harder now, their steps slower, but they made the journey together as they had made every journey for the past 40 years. They sat in the starlight, holding hands, and Rebecca rested her head on Samuel's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Samuel asked. "For finding my locket," Rebecca said. "For finding me, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful life." "Thank you for letting me love you," Samuel replied. "For not giving up on me, for teaching me that it was possible to be happy again." They sat in peaceful silence, two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and built a life that neither could have imagined alone. The valley stretched out before them, bathed in moonlight, the same valley where Samuel had tracked Rebecca's locket all those years ago. It was a place of memories now, sacred ground where their love story had begun. And as they sat together under the stars, Samuel and Rebecca knew that whatever time they had left, they would face it as they had faced everything else. Together, with love, with courage, and with gratitude for every single day they had been given. Their story, which had started with tears and a lost locket, had become something beautiful and enduring. It was a story they would tell their grandchildren, who would tell their own children, passing down not just the locket but the legacy of a love that had healed two broken hearts and created a family that would last for generations. The wind whispered through the valley, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. And Samuel and Rebecca, their hands intertwined and their hearts full, sat together in the place where their story began, grateful for every moment of the journey that had brought them here, to this perfect ending that was really just another beginning in the endless circle of love and life.